Have you ever considered how a man who has lived his entire life alone, isolated on a distant ranch, suddenly finds himself surrounded by 10 young women, all of whom show up at his doorstep on a stormy night? That's precisely what happened to Antonio Garcia, a strong and handsome rancher with a heart hardened by a lifetime of solitude. He could never have imagined that this single encounter would change the course of his life forever. And what happened in the end will leave you in shock. But before I reveal that outcome, I have to tell you everything from the very beginning. Only by understanding every detail of this period drama, filled with heartache and forbidden love, will you grasp why life had such an unexpected turn in store for him. If you enjoy stories from the olden days, full of human drama, impossible loves, and long-held secrets, then stay with me until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to Windswept Tales to keep discovering what happened in the past. I want you to imagine this scene with me, because this is how everything began to make sense, in the shock, the pain, and the silence that weighs more than any shout. It was a cold, pre-dawn morning on the dusty plains of Texas. A biting wind whipped through the golden prairie grass, and the moon still hung in the sky when the men in the old pickup truck pulled up to the small cemetery in Hope, Texas. The gravedigger's lantern trembled, and I saw with my own eyes the rope sliding, a crude wooden coffin creaking as it descended into the red earth below. No one cried, no one moved. All you could hear was the crunch of boots on mud, the faint clinking of the priest's rosary, and the muffled sobs of a young woman. Her face was pale and beautiful, her hair pinned back by a simple white scarf. She leaned over the edge of the grave and whispered something I couldn't understand. The wind carried her words away, but the pain they held, that pain reached me too. "It's time," murmured the gravedigger, his voice thick with dust, his shovel in hand. On the other side of the grave, standing still, was Antonio Garcia. At 30 years old, he was handsome, strong, and his arms looked as if they were made to lift the world. He gripped the brim of his cowboy hat with trembling fingers. From a distance, you'd swear he was a man of stone. Up close, I can tell you he was a man about to break. He didn't cry, he just squared his shoulders as if fate had tripped him and he was stubbornly trying to stay on his feet. "Father, can you—" His voice came out dry and rough. "Just say the blessing." The priest raised his hand and made the sign of the cross. The beads of his rosary jingled. In a corner, the townsfolk whispered, their words sharp as a knife. "They say he filled his ranch with those virgins from that abandoned convent. Now look, it was never going to end well. God sees everything." I moved closer to the wooden fence, and I swear it hurt to see how Elisa, at 20 years old with her pale, beautiful skin, bit her lip to keep from falling apart. She extended a shaking hand and touched the lid of the coffin, already covered in dust. It wasn't a touch of goodbye, it was a plea for forgiveness. And in that instant, I understood that the story I needed to tell you didn't begin there. That was just the open wound. The scar would come later. "Antonio," Elisa called out softly, without looking at anyone. "We need to talk now." "No," he answered, his voice short, the kind that makes a horse obey. "How we bury, later we face it." The gravedigger plunged his shovel into the dirt, and the first thud of earth hitting the coffin lid echoed through the dawn like a muffled drum. Twice. 3 times. With each thud, I saw Elisa's hands clench the fabric of her dress. I saw Antonio's jaw clench. I saw the townsfolk step back, fearing the weight of that sorrow would fall on them too. And I know you're also wondering, who is in that coffin? And why is this burial happening in such a hurry before the sun comes up? I won't tell you yet. To understand what was laid in that grave, you need to walk with me back to the night when those 10 young women showed up at the gates of the Lone Star Ranch, seeking shelter from the storm and the harsh judgment of the world. You need to see up close the loneliness Antonio carried and the fate that pushed 10 lives into a house that didn't have room for its own peace. You need to hear the conversations no one else heard, feel the weight of their choices, and discover why a heart so strong only truly beat when Elisa said his name. At the cemetery, the sound of the earth became a blanket. The priest closed his book. The townsfolk scattered like shadows. Only 3 remained. The gravedigger, who knows stories that aren't told, Elisa, with red eyes, and Antonio, who breathed as if he were holding a storm in his chest. "This doesn't end here," he said, not looking at anyone, and I felt that it wasn't a boast. "It never ended," Elisa replied, raising her face to look at him for the first time. In her eyes, there was fear and there was courage. "You know that." He put his hat back on, swallowed hard, and seemed taller than all of us. Not because of his already large muscles or the good looks the whole town talked about. It was something else. It was the weight of a promise I didn't yet know. A promise that, when it's revealed, will turn this story inside out. The gravedigger hit his shovel on the ground, wiped the sweat from his brow, and broke the silence. "Anything else you need?" Antonio took a deep breath. "Time. Time is something we don't have," the gravedigger said with the simplicity of a man who measures life in graves. Lisa pulled the scarf from her hair, tied it around Antonio's wrist as if mooring a boat to a dock. "Then we'll make it." And right there, with the coffin covered and the night nearly gone, I knew this story wasn't about a scandalous rumor whispered by the town. It was about two scarred souls that suffering insisted on bringing together. It was about choices made with a knife at the throat, about honor when honor comes at a high price, and about an ending that will take you completely by surprise. Because the truth buried in that red earth isn't what you think it is. Now, if you are still with me, take my hand and come. We're going back in time, into Antonio's house, to light the lamp and listen to the floorboards creak. Because what happened before that pre-dawn morning explains why that grave didn't just bury a body, it buried a secret. Before the storm hit the gates of the Lone Star Ranch, I knew Antonio Garcia by sight and by reputation. 30 years old, broad shoulders, muscles forged by lifting sacks of corn and breaking in wild horses. The Texas sun had tanned his skin to a beautiful bronze, and his deep-set brown eyes, always narrowed, made him look like a wary coyote, alert, suspicious, and ready to defend himself. But on the inside, I can tell you without a doubt, there was an old silence. The kind you only find in a big house after the last light has been put out. His routine was a clock without hands. His day began with the rooster's crow and ended when the moon was high in the sky. He'd wake to the creaking of the floorboards, pull on his thick leather boots, cinch his belt, and before anything else, he'd run his hand through the mane of his beloved horse, Ranger, the only friend who never abandoned him. In the kitchen, the iron coffee pot would hiss, filling the air with the smell of strong coffee and cornbread. Mrs. Rita, his elderly cook, the only living memory of his parents, would serve him the steaming mug without making too much noise. "Eat, my boy," she'd say in a soft voice, like someone who had watched time pass. "A man with an empty stomach thinks crooked." "I already think crooked by nature, Rita," he would reply, giving a half smile. But I swear I try to straighten out. After coffee came the corral. The leather whip would crack in the air as Antonio swung the lasso and the cattle would obey. Outsiders saw him as a man made of sheer strength and courage. But I, who saw him up close, noticed something else. Every move he made was to escape a thought that always came back. The memory of his parents, who had died in a car accident on that red dirt road. A night when the headlights failed and fate showed no mercy. Since then, the big house felt too big and the loneliness too heavy. In the small town of Hope, Antonio's name was on everyone's lips. At Mr. Iris's general store, he would buy salt, kerosene, and medicine for his calves. He spoke little, paid on time, and looked people in the eye. Respect isn't asked for, it's earned through work and silence, and he had plenty of both. Still, people would whisper, because that's what people do, and silence invites gossip. "A man who doesn't marry is no good," said Mrs. Eunice, sweeping her porch as if she were sweeping away sins. "He's better than those men who hang out at the saloon," retorted old Joe with the horse-drawn buggy, a man in his 50s with a trimmed mustache. "He just hasn't found a woman who can handle a hard life." Antonio pretended not to hear. When he needed to go to town, he'd tie up his horse, go into the store, finish his business in 5 minutes, and leave. What no one saw was what happened on the way back. He would stop by the river, take off his hat, splash water on his face, and speak softly to the flowing stream. "If you were here, I swear I could handle this," he'd say as if talking to his parents. but I've learned the world doesn't stop for those who suffer. The big house had a living room with old portraits in crooked frames and a wall clock that sometimes ran fast, sometimes slow, just like life. In his bedroom, the wardrobe held neatly ironed shirts, and on the nightstand, there was a black-covered notebook. He wrote everything down in it: calf births, fence repairs, rainy days, and every so often, a loose phrase, almost a confession. What we keep buried, the earth eventually claims. One afternoon in July, Father Henry showed up. He was a short man with a worn cassock, the kind of person who knows the mudry and the greatness of people. Antonio, he said, the church is organizing a work party to do some repairs. We need some timber and a couple of strong hands. I can give you the timber and the hands too, he replied, scratching his chin, but I don't promise much conversation. The priest smiled. I have enough conversation for both of us. Don't worry. Working with the priest created cracks in the walls of his solitude. Between one beam and another, Henry would risk a few short questions without prying. Do you sleep well? Enough to get up early. And your heart? My heart works in its own way. Sometimes in the late afternoon, Rita would lean on the porch with her broom, her eyes welling up with tears of unspoken knowledge. Mr. Antonio, this house needs joy. Joys tire a person out, Rita, he joked awkwardly. Work gives my mind rest, but you can't invite joy. It comes when it wants. And at that time, what arrived first was a rumor. Mr. Aris at the general store said that a convent a few towns over had closed its doors because of debts, and that 10 young women, all very young, had been sent away overnight with no place to go. The conversation reached the ears of the townsfolk and quickly became a prophecy. If those girls show up here, it's going to cause trouble, someone said, sharpening their words. A proper girl's place is under a family roof. Antonio heard this with a frown, but he didn't comment. Yet in the following pre-dawn hours, he dreamed of light footsteps on his porch and voices asking for shelter. He woke up in a sweat, his heart pounding. Dreams are messages, Rita always said. He pretended not to believe her. That same day, a heavy rain fell, beating on the tin roof and bringing with it the smell of damp earth. Antonio led the cattle to the shelter, reinforced the gate locks, put out the lamp in the living room, and stood for a moment in the darkness, listening to the house breathe. That's when Rita appeared in the doorway, her apron clutched to her chest. My boy, do you hear that? What is it, Rita? There are people at the gate, people with high voices. Antonio grabbed his poncho, put on his hat, and went out, his heart racing, not from fear, but from a feeling that was hard to explain. On his way, he ran his hand along the wooden fence planks, feeling the roughness, as if to confirm he was still in this world. The sound of the rain drowned out everything else, but when he got close, he heard it clearly. It was crying, and it was the crying of many trembling voices, begging. Up until that moment, Antonio's life had been a straight path. Work, silence, brief faith in a long memory. The man the town called a loner wasn't cold. He was wounded. And a wound that doesn't heal becomes a discipline. He organized his heart the same way he organized his ranch. Everything in its place with no room for improvisation. But life, as you know, doesn't respect maps. And on that night, the path was about to bend. Before he reached the gate's lock, Antonio took a deep breath. His hands, large and steady, trembled for a moment. He opened the gate. A flash of lightning lit up the sky as if God had struck a match to get a closer look. On the other side, soaked and with their dresses clinging to their bodies, 10 young women stood, huddled together. In the middle of them, a woman with very pale skin and a face too beautiful for such a terrible moment, looked up and said, almost whispering, "We need shelter, even if it's just for tonight. The rest, you already know, is going to hurt before it gets better." But what I needed to show you in this part is who Antonio was before destiny walked into his house without an invitation. A man of strength, marked by absence, who had learned to live with silence like a person taming a wild horse, with respect and fear. And it is with this man and the weight of his story that the door will open to what will change everything. If you've been with me this far, hold my hand, and in the next part, we'll cross that gate together. The silence of a long, lonely life reigns supreme on the Lone Star Ranch. It wasn't the good kind of silence that comes after a day's hard work, but a hollow emptiness that moved through the rooms like a restless owner, opening and closing doors, rustling curtains, and unsettling Antonio's mind. And I need to take you inside that silence so you can understand why, when the 10 young women appeared, his heart trembled like an old fence in a strong wind. The big house smelled of waxed wood and reheated coffee. The tall windows let in a pale light in the late afternoon, and the wall clock with its fussy hands marked steps that no one took. In the hallway, the black and white portraits of his parents in their faded frames watched Antonio every time he passed with the heavy footsteps of a man who carries a lot on his shoulders. "Rita," he called, stopping at the kitchen door. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what, my boy?" "Nothing," he answered, and the word fell to the floor like a cold cup. "That's what I hear, nothing." Rita dried her hands on her apron and came closer, her eyes full of a mother's concern. "A long silence turns into bad thoughts. Eat a bowl of soup, warm yourself up, and go to bed early." He tried. He sat at the long table where only one plate was ever set, always on the same side with the same cutlery. The spoon clinked softly against the bottom of the bowl. Outside, the wind rattled the trees. Inside, Antonio stared at the empty chair at the end of the table, where his father used to boast about a cheap steer he'd bought, and his mother would laugh, both fierce and sweet, telling him not to show off. "You left too early, you know," he murmured, not ashamed to speak to the past. "I hadn't even learned to pray right yet." On the wall, his father's hat hung as if he might walk in from the field at any moment. Antonio got up, opened his black-covered notebook, and in the middle of notes about salt and mineral counts, rain, and vaccinations, he wrote a crooked line. "Today, the house feels heavy." He went out onto the porch. The yard stretched out in shadows. Ranger stirred the straw in his trough and snorted contentedly. Antonio scratched the animal's neck, and Ranger rested his head on Antonio's chest as if he understood people. "You don't ask questions, do you, Ranger?" He smiled faintly. "That's why I like you." On the other side of the fence, the river flowed faithfully. Antonio went down to the bank, rolled up his pants, and put his feet in the water. The cold rose quickly, waking his senses. He closed his eyes and let the current carry away a few seconds of his thoughts. "Father Henry says a man needs company," he said to himself. "But the wrong kind of company weighs more than loneliness." The day before, the priest had stopped by again. He'd brought a few bricks and some well-chosen words, the way only an old priest knows how. "Antonio, God didn't promise an easy life. He promised a path. The rest is for each of us to walk." "My path is long, Father," Antonio replied. "So what I lack is the courage to share the road." A priest's words have a way of lingering in your head. Henry's did. Antonio came up from the river, shook the water off his feet, and back on the porch, he saw the sky gathering clouds into a heavy gray that promised a long rain. He didn't like to sleep during a storm. The ranch house would creak, the roof would groan, the animals would get restless, and the silence, paradoxically, would grow even louder. Rita appeared again with a lantern. "Take this. Tonight promises to be a rough one." "Thank you," he said, taking the lantern, but not going inside. He stood watching the yard as if expecting a visitor who hadn't set a time. The silence then began to tell stories he had always tried to ignore. The curve in the road where his parents' car vanished. The funeral mass. The house key he had received in his early 20s, and the promise he'd made with no one to witness it, that he would never sell an inch of the land. A promise is something that ties you up inside. Sometimes it ties you so tight you forget you can loosen it. "This house needs some laughter, Antonio," Rita insisted later, leaning against the doorframe. "Even I'm forgetting how to laugh." "I know, Rita, but what's the point of laughing? To just go back to silence later? To remember that we're still breathing." He walked to the living room, took the dust cover off his mother's old piano, and ran his fingers over the keys he hadn't touched since he was a boy. A crooked but living sound came out. A faltering melody filled the air and chased away the ghost for 3 minutes. Then the silence returned, patient, like something that knows how to wait. At that very moment, far from there, rumors of the closed convent were spreading through town. But in Antonio's heart, what was really stirring was a feeling he couldn't name. It was different from fear. It was as if the house were taking a deeper breath, preparing to receive people. And you see, when you've lived in the dark for a long time, you learn to notice when the air changes. He went up to his room, sat on the edge of the bed, the floorboard complaining softly, and pulled a yellowed envelope from a drawer. His mother's neat handwriting read, "To my son, for when your heart feels heavy." He had read it so many times that he knew it by heart, but he opened it anyway, like someone opening medicine. "Son, when the house seems too big, don't make yourself smaller. Fill the house with work, with faith, with the right kind of people. Don't be afraid to take care of those who need it, and those who take care of others find a reason to stay." He carefully folded the letter, and it was right then. That was the exact moment the silence lost its reign. First, a different kind of sound, a timid one, broke through the rain. 3 short knocks on the wooden gate, then thin, weary voices, a plea that any man's heart hears, even if he doesn't want to. Antonio jumped to his feet. The loneliness that had been his companion for years was left behind like a forgotten coat. In the hallway, he ran into Rita, who was coming in the opposite direction, her eyes wide. "My boy, I heard it." He grabbed his hat and the lantern and walked out into the night. Every step he took was a goodbye to a piece of the silence that had ruled his entire life. And deep down, I want you to understand, what made Antonio open that gate wasn't curiosity or a desire for conversation or a rush to solve someone else's problem. It was the courage to obey his mother's letter. And sometimes courage is just that, taking one step out of the room when fear tells you to stay put. The rain was hitting like lead. He reached the lock, took a breath, and before lifting the latch, he looked back at the big house, at his mother's piano, at his father's chair, at the lamp lit in the kitchen. Everything was silent, but no longer empty, because in that instant, the silence stopped being the owner and became a witness. When the gate opened, thunder cracked across the sky, and the brief flash of lightning revealed 10 young faces, drenched, scared, but with steady eyes. In the center, a woman with very pale skin and a beauty that hurt to look at. Elisa stepped forward and said, "We need shelter." And that is how the silence of a lifetime was broken by a simple request. The rest, is still going to hurt before it gets better. But the story that will turn your heart inside out began here. At the exact second, a man tired of talking to walls decided to listen to people. The rain fell heavily that night. The sound of fat drops on the roof tiles mixed with the wind that made the big house's windows creak. Antonio Garcia, with a lantern in his hand and his hat soaked, opened the gate without imagining that he was about to change his life forever. On the other side, huddled under the storm, were 10 young women, all very young, their dresses stuck to their bodies by the rain. Each face carried a plea for help, but also a deep silence of those who had already suffered much. In the middle of them, Elisa, the most fragile at first glance, raised her clear eyes and fixed them on Antonio. Her voice, though low, cut through the storm. "Please, sir, give us shelter, even if it's just for this one night." Antonio remained silent for a few seconds. He looked at each face before him, and each face seemed to carry a story of pain that didn't need to be told in words. He took a deep breath and answered curtly, as was his way. "Come in." The girls looked at each other, some crying with relief, and together they passed through the gate. Rita, seeing them come, made the sign of the cross and whispered to herself, "My God, what kind of test are you putting on this house?" When they entered the porch, Antonio pulled one of the large wooden chairs closer and spoke with firmness. "Listen closely. In here, no one will speak louder than my orders. You have a bed, you have food, but you must respect my house. I don't know what happened to you, and I don't want to know tonight. I only ask that you bring peace." The women nodded in silence. Elisa, however, dared to step forward. "You think we're trouble, don't you? But we just want a roof over our heads until we know where to go." He stared at her, and for a moment, his hard gaze wavered. There was a resolve in her eyes that he hadn't seen since his mother's. "I don't know what you are, but I do know that rain like this can kill people, and no one is going to die of cold on my doorstep." He got up and went to the kitchen. He put more wood on the iron stove and shouted to Rita, "Make soup for 10 more mouths and strong coffee." Rita, though suspicious, obeyed. The kitchen, which until then had served only two people, suddenly filled with low voices, timid footsteps, and the warmth of bodies gathering by the fire. The loneliness of the big house began to break into fragments. As the women dried off, one of them, named Margaret, looked at Elisa and whispered, "Do you think he'll let us stay more than one night?" "I don't know," Elisa replied, "but something tells me our story is going to change here." Outside, the storm raged. Inside, for the first time in years, the ranch seemed to pulse with life. But along with the relief, a new wariness was also born. Antonio knew that 10 young women in his house would be a reason for sharp tongues in town. What was supposed to be just a night of shelter was about to turn into a burden no one could have imagined carrying. That night, the silence gave way to murmurs, prayers, and sighs. Antonio's heart, which had grown accustomed to beating alone, now felt the weight of a responsibility he had never asked for, but which he could no longer refuse. Because fate, my friend, doesn't ask for permission. It arrives, knocks on the door, and once you open it, there's no going back. Life on the Lone Star Ranch settled into a rhythm that only people in the countryside understand. The sun rose, the roosters crowed, calloused hands went to work, and in the middle of this routine, a feeling grew beneath the surface, silent as a tree's root. Between Antonio Garcia, 30 years old, and Elisa, 20, what began as gratitude turned into care. Care turned into presence, and presence, without asking permission, turned into love. A hidden love, because beyond the ranch's fences, malice had its eyes on them. And inside there were 9 witnesses who, even without meaning to, could turn a tender feeling into suspicion. Nothing escaped their unspoken rules. Antonio kept his distance. In the corral, he would teach Margaret how to braid a lasso. He would ask Helen to write down the cattle count in his notebook and show Rose how to find a good source of drinking water. Elisa would watch from a distance without invading his space, but all it took was a small moment. The way she tied her scarf, the way she handled the bucket at the well, and their eyes would meet for a quick second, as if to say, "Amoy, I'm here." At night, his mother's piano, silent for years, began to speak in a whisper. First, 2 uncertain notes, then a simple melody, repeated slowly. Elisa would walk across the room with light steps and stop beside the instrument. "Did your mother teach you?" she'd ask, almost a breath. "She did," he'd answer without looking at her. "She used to say that music holds the house together when the wind comes." On one of those nights, Rita had gone up to bed early, tired. The lantern cast a circle of yellow light. Elisa stopped behind Antonio and, with great care, placed her hand on his shoulder. He closed his eyes like someone finding water after a long drought. "If the storm comes, I'll stand at the door," Elisa said, "even if I'm just a small body against the world. I don't want you in front of the wind." His voice hardened, but it was a protective hardness. "I'll face it." They knew they couldn't promise each other anything, but life is stubborn when it finds 2 wounded hearts. It stitches them together and calls it fate. Then came the little secrets that sustain forbidden loves. A white scarf purposefully left on a chair, a piece of hard candy left on the windowsill of the office, a short note hidden between the pages of the black-covered notebook. "When the house feels too big, look at me." In the yard, amidst clotheslines full of laundry and the smell of soap, Lydia was the first to notice something was different. Not out of jealousy, but with the intuition of an adult woman who had seen love light up other people's faces. "Elisa, pay attention," she whispered one afternoon. "The people outside are just waiting for a reason to talk. And the girls in here, each one carries her own pain. Everything can flare up easily." "I know," Elisa said, tightening her grip on the wet cloth. "But there are some things we don't choose. We just take care of them." Taking care became a discipline. They began to talk only where the house couldn't hear, in the stable, while Ranger chewed quietly, in the corn shed with a rustling of the husks sounding like rain, or on the porch after everyone else had grown tired of thinking. "Are you afraid of me, Elisa?" he asked one time, without beating around the bush. "I'm afraid of losing what we've barely started," she answered firmly. "But not of you. I'm afraid of what the world does to those who love outside the rules." He held her hand with the strength of a man who knows that holding hands is also a promise. And yet he pulled back a step because of the other 9. Justice, in Antonio's mind, was a fence you couldn't open on one side and close on the other. If the women were here under his protection, he wouldn't be the first to break that trust. The love he felt became a pact of patience. Outside, Justino Hernandez hadn't forgotten his humiliation. He sent 2 men to patrol the road at night. The dogs barking announced visitors. The rustling in the tall grass revealed shadows. Antonio reinforced the gates, checked the locks, and put an old shotgun behind the door, not because he liked it, but for defense. Elisa saw him keeping watch and understood, without him having to say it, that the danger wasn't just in the gossip. It came on horseback, with full pockets and empty souls. "If they tighten the noose, I'll take you all far away," he promised in a whisper that barely reached her. "And leave your land," she replied. "We can plant new land," he said, "but you can't replant the people you love." Their romance, then, chose the most dignified way to exist, not in haste but in respect. No hidden meetings that could dishonor the others. No loud promises that could become ammunition for the town. What existed between them was a fine stitching, stitch by stitch, night after night. Even so, a ranch is a living thing, and a living thing feels when a heart beats differently. Rose, the most impulsive, spoke her mind at the wash basin without thinking. "If the boss looks more at one of us, the rest of us become shadows." "Hush, girl," Margaret cut her off, with the experience of someone who had been hurt by life. "There are times when we cause more trouble than we help." The word, however, ran like a spark. It didn't start a fight, but it created tension. And that's when Antonio made the decision that would mark everyone. He called all 10 into the large living room. He stood, his hands resting on the back of his father's chair, the piano a silent witness. "Listen closely," he said, looking at each of them. "As long as you are in this house, no one will be worth less than another. Whoever needs medicine will have it. Whoever needs to learn will have a chance. Whoever needs a way forward, and I will find it. And above all, no one here will be a cause for dishonor. Not you, not me." Elisa kept her eyes on the floor, her heart divided between gratitude and the quiet fear of losing the little they had. "If someone from the outside knocks on this door," Antonio continued, "I will answer first. If I must, I will become a wall. But I don't want any disagreements in here. Our strength is in staying together." The pact didn't erase what was between them, but it purified it. It hurt, because love wants arms and a future. But it became as clean as spring water, without haste and without guilt. As a gift, Elisa left a short red string with a knot on his desk. It seemed like nothing, but it said everything. "I will wait." Antonio tied the string around his wrist under his shirt and went about his day with the courage of a man who carries a secret that gives him strength. That night, the wind changed. The smell of stirred-up dust came down the hallway before the heavy footsteps. The dogs growled. Rita put out the lamp with a quick puff of air, an old gesture of someone who knows how to read omens. Outside in the dark, a horse snorted and a saddle creaked. Antonio's hand rested on the shotgun's grip, and he looked at Elisa. She nodded, without tears, without a scene, just a gesture that meant everything. "Be strong." Their secret romance had become a kind of prayer. Quiet, constant, and true. And it was precisely because it was true that it was now going to be tested. Because destiny, when it wants to test what we feel, doesn't send a note. It knocks on the door in the middle of the night. The tension inside the Lone Star Ranch was no longer the same as in the first few days. The shelter that had brought relief began to turn into a burden. The 10 women, once united by fear, started to feel the difference in glances, gestures, and even silences. With each passing day, it became clearer. Between Antonio Garcia and Elisa, there was something no one could deny. It wasn't just conversations on the porch or hands that touched by chance. It was the way he protected her when someone from outside showed up. It was the way she took the lead, assuming responsibilities, speaking with firmness. And this bond, as discreet as it was, created sparks of jealousy. One night, as they were arranging the mattresses in the collective room, Rose, the most impulsive of the group, let out what she had been holding in her throat. We all came here together, but it seems like only one of us has become important in this house. The comment fell like a stone in the middle of the group. Margaret, always the oldest and most level-headed, tried to calm things down. Don't talk nonsense, girl. The boss treats us all the same. No, he doesn't, Margaret, Rose replied, her eyes flashing. He looks at Elisa in a way he doesn't look at any of us, and this is going to cause trouble. Elisa remained silent, but her heart ached. She knew Rose was saying what the others were also thinking, even if they didn't speak it. Days later, while Antonio was repairing a fence in the field, Elisa went to him. She was carrying a pitcher of fresh water, but what she really wanted was to unburden her heart. Antonio, the girls are starting to feel left out. I don't want to be a reason for division. He stopped hammering, rested his knee on the wire, and looked at her. You are not at fault for any of this. What I feel is hard to hide, but I can't let this house become a stage for a fight. She clutched the pitcher to her chest. So what are we going to do? Pretend it doesn't exist? Antonio took a deep breath, his voice hoarse from fighting himself. If we have to, yes, because I promised myself that none of you would suffer here. And if the town is already pointing fingers at us, I won't give them a reason to call you dishonorable. Elisa lowered her eyes, swallowing her tears. She knew he was right, but the pain of holding back what she felt was cruel. Inside the house, Rita also sensed the growing tension. One day she called Antonio into the kitchen while stirring a pot of beans. My boy, you carry the weight of the world on your back, and you still want to carry the hearts of others. But at some point, that weight is going to break your legs. He leaned against the doorframe, tired. What do you want me to do, Rita? Kick out people who have nowhere to go? Pretend I don't feel what I feel? I don't know what you should do, she said. I only know that every choice has a price, and you're going to have to pay it, whether you want to or not. Antonio's face hardened, but he knew she was right. The love he felt for Elisa was pure, but it was surrounded by prying eyes, jealousy, and the malice of others. Any misstep could cost him everything: his honor, the safety of the women, and even his own life. That night, alone on the porch, he stared at the starry sky and murmured, Mom, Dad, if I choose my heart, I lose the house. If I choose the house, I lose my heart. What do I do? The silence of the night brought no answer. Only the distant crow of a rooster and the creaking of the wood reminded him that time was passing, indifferent to the pain of men. And that's how the weight of the choice fell on Antonio Garcia: to love in secret or to renounce it to protect everyone. A burden that no rancher, no matter how strong, could carry without bleeding on the inside. Night fell heavily on the Lone Star Ranch, the kind where the wind enters the cracks as if it's looking for someone. The dogs began to bark with a low, warning sound, not one of surprise. Rita put out the lamp with a quick breath and put a finger to her lips for the girls to be silent. Antonio Garcia stood on the porch, his old shotgun propped on his shoulder, and remained motionless, listening to the plains as if reading a letter in the dark. Stay into the back room, he said, his voice low and firm. Lock the window. No one opens it until I say so. Elisa looked him straight in the eye, her eyes wide, without a tremor. I'm staying here. You are going to stay alive, he replied curtly. Go. The thundering of horses came first, then the dust, and finally the silhouettes. 4, 5, 6 riders. In front, Justino Hernandez dismounted slowly, savoring the scene like a vulture. Behind him, his men with bandanas over their faces, their knives glinting in the moonlight, and 2 torches lit, threatening to turn the yard into embers. Good evening, neighbor, Justino shouted mockingly. I've come to collect what's mine, half of those women. The rest you can choose to hand over now or later. Antonio didn't move a muscle. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, released the calf, and stared at the men. What are you doing here? Justino laughed, showing his yellowed teeth. To make a deal. These girls don't have family. They don't have an owner. We'll pay you well and take 3 or 4. That way you'll have fewer mouths to feed. Rita, who was bringing a bucket of water, froze. Her heart seemed to want to jump out of her chest. Antonio, however, didn't move. His voice came out deep and dry. No one here is for sale or for rent. If that's your talk, you can turn back. One of the men laughed and nudged his companion. See, The man thinks he's got a harem. Who'd have thought? Antonio took a deep breath. His hand instinctively went to the handle of the large knife tucked into his belt. His firm muscles showed he would not back down. I'll say this only once. Get out of here. The silence that followed seemed heavier than the heat of the sun. Even the cattle in the corral were quiet, as if waiting for the outcome. Justino narrowed his eyes, pulled on his horse's reins, and spat on the ground. You're going to regret this, Antonio. You don't keep women like this. The town doesn't trust you, and soon everyone will be against you. They turned to leave, but left behind the feeling of a threat. Antonio watched until they disappeared into the dust of the road. Then he put the knife away with steady hands, but deep down he knew. It wasn't over. That night, Elisa found him on the porch, sitting with an unlit cigarette between his fingers. They'll come back, won't they? She asked softly. They will. People like that don't swallow their pride. What are we going to do? He looked at her, his eyes hard and at the same time tired. We're going to resist. This land has withstood worse storms than those men. I can handle it too. She came closer, almost touching his hand, but pulled back when she heard footsteps behind them. It was Rita bringing coffee. My boy, be careful. Those men aren't joking. If you have to, send the girls away before things get worse. Antonio hit his hand on the wooden table, the dry sound cutting through the air. No, I'm not sending anyone out into the cold. If the whole town wants to judge me, let them. But no one is going to touch them in here. His face, lit by the lantern, showed the resolve of a man who was ready to fight, no matter the cost. That night, the wind blew hard, swaying the trees around the ranch. It was as if nature sensed that, from then on, Antonio's fight wouldn't just be against the prejudice of people, but against the evil of those who wanted to steal not only the honor of those women, but also the peace that, even in the midst of suffering, was beginning to blossom inside that house. Destiny was already setting its trap, and no one there knew how much more pain would be needed for love and truth to come to light. The day dragged on slowly after the night of bloodshed. Through the living room window, a soft light came in, whitening the old walls. Elisa was breathing in short, firm breaths. Rita changed her bandages with the hands of someone who had learned to heal with what life had given her. The other 9 women moved in silence, bringing warm water, clean cloths, and light broth. Antonio Garcia remained by her side, his shirt open at the wide chest, his face hardened by exhaustion and faith. It was as if he were holding the entire house up on his own back. Around noon, the sound of a familiar, careful horse broke the calm. Father Henry appeared on the porch, his cassock still damp with dust, his hat clutched in his hand, and his eyes full of worry. I heard about the shooting in town, he said, coming inside. I came to see the wounded and to bring an old matter that weighs on my pocket and on my soul. Antonio looked up, alert. If you've come to talk about blame, Father, you are too late. I already paid with fear all night. Henry placed a hand on his shoulder, a friendly gesture. I came to talk about the truth. He took a brown envelope from the lining of his cassock, stamped with the parish seal from Santa Fe and a woman's careful handwriting. It read, For Elisa, if danger ever comes, the air in the room changed, like when still water decides to run. The old Mother Superior of the convent gave me this before she fell ill, the priest explained. She said it should only be opened if the girl was in danger and if she wanted to know who she was. The order was to keep it until she turned 20. Elisa raised her head from the pillow. The words arranged themselves inside her like pieces of a puzzle that life had been trying to hide. I want to know, she whispered. Whatever it is. Henry looked at Antonio. The rancher nodded. Go ahead, open it. No one here runs from the truth. The priest carefully broke the seal. 3 things slipped out. A yellowed copy of a baptism record, a short note written by the Mother Superior, and a small, worn silver medallion with the intertwined letters J.H. engraved on it. Rita put a hand to her mouth. Antonio felt the skin on his arm prickle. Henry read slowly, like someone who knows every syllable changes a person's fate. The child left at the convent was registered as Elisa, but was born with the baptismal name Lucia. Her father, a man of means and many feuds in the region, asked for secrecy in exchange for her upkeep. He left a medallion with the initials J.H. and a sum of money. The mother, a young woman from out of town, couldn't bear the shame and left. The girl grew up without guilt. If danger ever comes, show her the sign. The silence this time wasn't empty. It was a silence filled with things that had finally found a name. Elisa touched the medallion with slow fingers. Her eyes filled not with fear, but with an understanding that both hurt and soothed at the same time. "JH," she repeated, almost inaudibly. Antonio, standing, his jaw locked, stared at the priest. "Just say it, Henry. The letter might not say it, but the town has been saying it for years." The priest took a deep breath. "We live next to a single emblem here. Land, cattle, barbed wire, and fights over water. JH isn't just initials on a medallion. It's a mark on a gate and a brand on a steer." He held up the medallion, which glinted in the light. "JH for Justino Hernandez." The name dropped into the room like a stone in a lake. The ripples of the impact slowly reached every face. Margaret closed her eyes. Helen's jaw set. Rose put a hand to her chest. Rita whispered a short prayer, one of those you learn as a girl. Antonio slowly lowered his head, as if an old thought had finally found its ground. "You mean?" His voice came out thick. "The bullet that almost took her life came from the hand of her own father?" Elisa clutched the medallion. Time for a moment was suspended between three truths: who she was, who had wounded her, and who loved her. "Father," she said firmly, despite the pain. "Are you sure?" Henry nodded sadly. "I cannot violate what was said in confession, my daughter. But what is in this paper and in the world around this house speaks for itself. At the time, Justino was a rich, ambitious young man. His family was pushing for marriage and land. A child outside of that arrangement." He lowered his eyes. "That's the kind of thing powerful men bury with money." Outside, a creak at the gate. The dogs growled. Justino appeared on the porch without an invitation. Two men behind him, hats low, faces hard. He took one step into the room and stopped, paralyzed by the scene. The wounded woman, the medallion in her hand, the priest, Rita, the other girls, and Antonio, whole but ready for whatever came. "I came to get mine," he began, but the phrase died in his throat when his eyes fell on the gleaming silver. The past crossed his face like a blade. "Where did you get that?" he demanded hoarsely. Elisa raised her chin, as pale as the medallion itself. "You left it at the convent, sir, before you forgot about me." Justino stumbled a half step, as if the house had moved. His hands, accustomed to holding reins and revolvers, trembled. "The child's name?" he choked out. "Lucia," the priest completed. "Renamed Elisa." The ranch owner closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was no arrogance, only a kind of old shock that had been stored for years. "I told them to take care of her," he murmured, "that no one should ever know." Antonio took a step, standing between Justino and Elisa, his body a wall and a bridge at the same time. "Well, now everyone knows," he said softly. "Even you, and knowing has a price." Justino tried to regain his composure, but his voice betrayed him. "I didn't know it was her. I swear on everything I've ever loved." "But you shot anyway," Rita retorted with the hardness that old age gives without asking. "You shot at what you didn't recognize because you never had the courage to claim it." The hired men, not fully understanding, took a step back, their eyes long and narrow. This was no longer a power struggle. It was a reckoning with the past. Elisa, still pale, gestured for space. Antonio leaned in, and she spoke, her voice clear. "I am not currency or a problem or a secret. I'm a person." She looked at Justino. "If you are my father, listen. What saved me was not your old money. It was the love I found in here. And love cannot be bought or sent away in the rain." Her words hung in the air, firm as a fence post in the middle of a road. Outside, the wind stirred up the smell of wet earth. Inside, the past and the present faced each other. Justino lowered his hat, swallowed hard, and for a fleeting moment, someone there could see the young man he had been before he became so hardened. But pride, that old bad horse, still rode him. "I didn't come to fight," he gave in at last. "I came to see if the girl was alive." "She is," Antonio replied, "and she's going to stay that way." The rancher looked one last time at the medallion, then at his own boots. When he raised his head, There was a remnant of a man in the place of the boss. He turned slowly and left, taking with him a shadow that no longer fit in that room. When the sound of his horse's hooves faded, the air seemed to untangle. Father Henry put the note back in the envelope and handed it to Elisa. "It's yours now," he said, "and the decisions are yours too." Elisa held the medallion against her chest and closed her eyes. A tear fell, not from weakness, but from relief for finally having a name for her origin and for knowing that her destiny was not born of that same shadow. Antonio knelt beside her and, taking her hand with the same firmness he used to hold Ranger's reins. "If you want, I'll throw this medallion in the river," he promised gently. "We don't need painful memories." She shook her head slowly. "No, I want to remember so I never repeat it, and so I know that what unites us doesn't come from fear. It comes from courage." The room breathed again. The 9 women drew closer, forming a circle of women around the wounded girl, women who no longer asked for permission to exist. Rita smiled faintly, like someone watching a birth without a midwife. It hurt, but it was a beginning. The truth, after all, had come to light. Elisa was the enemy's daughter, and the man who loved her was the same one who, without knowing it, had put the medallion in her path. The world had turned full circle, only to land at the feet of that house. Outside, the clouds began to part. In the corral, Ranger stamped his hoof impatiently, and inside the Lone Star Ranch, a new map was drawn. One of forgiveness, which was not yet certain if it could exist, one of justice, which now had a name, and one of love that, even wounded, remained standing. Because sometimes the great reversal doesn't come with a fanfare. It comes with a cold medallion in the palm of your hand and a quiet, "Now I know," said with the voice of someone who almost left. The afternoon faded with the Texas sky ablaze and an August wind that swept the dust from the road as if to prepare the ground for something big. Inside the house, Elisa could now sit up, pale but firm. Antonio Garcia, standing by her side, seemed taller than the door itself, not because of his muscles, but because of the resolve he carried in his heart. The medallion with the initials JH rested on the towel, silent as a judge. "If they come back, I'll talk," Elisa said, her voice without a tremor. "This time, I'll do the talking." Antonio ran his hand through her hair slowly. "You don't need to prove who you are. I need to prove who I've chosen to be." That's when the dogs barked low, not with fear, but with a premonition. The thundering of horses came fully, raising dust and past mistakes. Justino Hernandez appeared at the gate again, but this time he was alone, except for 2 men who stayed further back. He carried a weight on his face that money couldn't relieve. Antonio walked onto the porch without a weapon, with only the courage of a man who had already given all he had to give. "If you came to finish the war, you can leave," he said firmly. "There's no conquest in here, just people." Justino did not raise his voice. He dismounted slowly, took off his hat, and for a moment the hardened boss disappeared. Only a late father remained. "I didn't come to take anyone," he replied in a tone the town had never heard from him. "I came to stop them from taking anyone. My men spread the word. Other people started what they shouldn't have. Today I heard rumors that more than 10 men are coming." A heavy silence fell on the porch. Antonio's jaw was clenched. "If they come, they'll find a wall." "They'll find more than that," Justino said. "They'll find me." He took a deep breath, like a person gathering courage for a confession. "My whole life I've bought silence. Today I'm paying the bill. I've come to ask you to let me stand by your side. Not as an owner, but as a bad father trying not to be worse." Rita appeared behind the curtain, her small eyes seeing right to the core. Elisa got up, leaning on the post, the medallion clutched in her fingers. "If you're staying, it's to protect the women I call my sisters," she said clearly. "And the man I love." Justino nodded, swallowing hard. "That's exactly what I came for." The night didn't wait. The first shadows appeared like snakes in the grass. 6, 8, 12 riders gathered at the gate. They were faces from other ranches, men who saw an opportunity in someone else's misfortune. Torches were raised, shouts cut through the air. The mob that malice calls forth. Antonio took a step forward. Beside him, Justino, the past and the present, shoulder to shoulder. "I'm in charge here," growled the man in front, a Norbert Pierce known for not respecting fences or prayers. "Open the house, or we'll set the ground on fire." Justino walked 2 steps forward, and for the first time in many years, his voice didn't come from a position of power. It came from within. This gate has my brand and my guilt on it. Today, it has my word. Turn back. No one touches these women. No one touches this house. The men laughed loudly, laughing at the man they were used to seeing give orders, not ask for help. Norbert raised his torch, ready to throw it on the porch. The world held its breath. That's when the shot came from the dark, dry, precise, aimed at Antonio's chest. The crack cut the night like a knife. Elisa screamed, but there was no time for fear. Justino threw himself in front of Antonio, his arms open, his entire body, and the impact sent him flying backward. Norbert's torch fell, rolled, and went out in the wet dirt. "Dad!" The word left Elisa without passing through her mind, just through her blood. Antonio dove, holding the heavy body, and laid him on the porch, the smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat and dust. Justino searched for Elisa's face with a gentle urgency, like someone who doesn't want to lose the last good image. "Lucia," he whispered for the first time, saying the name he had given his daughter. "I did everything wrong, but don't let my mistake become your destiny." Elisa was crying without making a sound, as people who don't want to disturb what is sacred cry. Antonio pressed his hand to the wound, the hands of a working man trying to hold on to a life that was slipping away like spring water. "Hold on," he pleaded. "Hold on, and we'll fix what life has messed up." Justino fumbled in his jacket pocket with trembling fingers, pulled out a crumpled stack of papers with signatures and seals. "I came for this. I signed it today. Half of my land goes to all of them, in their names, and the other half," his eyes met Antonio's, "is for Elisa, to be a gift to the man who didn't run." Rita put a hand to her chest. Margaret's eyes widened. Helen began to pray aloud without even realizing she was praying. On the road, the mob hesitated, seeing the most powerful man in the region on the ground, offering his own life for people he had cast away, broke the logic of their malice. Norbert pulled his nervous horse back, and when Antonio raised the shotgun with his free hand, not to kill but to mark a line, the men retreated, 1, 2, 5 steps until they became shadows once again. Justino had a dark stain of blood at the corner of his mouth. The sky was low and beautiful, full of stars that looked like God's lanterns. He looked for his daughter with his eyes and found her. "Forgive me for what I wasn't. If you can't, at least let me be the wall this one last time." Elisa leaned her forehead against his, her warm tears falling, washing away what was left of his pride. "I forgive you for what you tried to be today," she said, her voice firm and sweet, as only pain can make a person, "and for what I had to learn without you." Justino smiled the way men who have made mistakes smile when they finally get it right, small but whole. "Thank you," he looked at Antonio. "Take care of her with my life," Antonio replied without hesitation. The rancher closed his eyes, and it was as if the night, which had been so heavy, became lighter for a moment, like when the wind calms after a storm. Justino's hand slipped from Elisa's and came to rest on the medallion. It was no longer a weight, it was respect. In the corral, Ranger stamped his hoof, and the sound seemed to echo far away, in the hills, on the fences, in the entire town that would wake up to a different morning. Antonio remained kneeling, his large body bowed in a gesture that wasn't defeat, but reverence for the man who, at the right moment, had chosen to be a father. Elisa took a deep breath, wiped her tears with the back of her hand, and with Rita's help, rose to her feet. With a voice that held the world, she said to the 9 women who were now forming a circle around them, "We weren't born to be afraid. We were born to stand tall," Antonio completed, his voice grave, placing the papers in the center of the table. "From this day on, this house has a name and an owner, all of you, and it has a purpose to be a shelter for anyone who has been cast out by the world." Outside, the stars continued to shine. Inside, the wounds had owners, the land had a purpose, and love, finally, had a safe place to be. The great reversal didn't arrive with bugles. It arrived with a life given in the right place at the right time so that other lives could go on. When the pre-dawn hours had drunk the last of the tears, Antonio took the medallion from Justino's hand and placed it around Elisa's neck. He kissed her forehead. "Now this isn't a weight, It's a memory, and our memory is going to a beautiful one. She leaned against his chest, and there, between pain, forgiveness, and a promise, two destinies that had walked so long apart finally met, stitched together by a suffering that did not break them, but united them. And that's why, when the morning light hit the yard, the Lone Star Ranch was no longer a scene of scandal. It was a home of justice. And the love of Antonio and Elisa, born in the dark, became light. The days that followed on the Lone Star Ranch were unlike anything that had ever been seen on that land. The house that for so long as a symbol of silence and solitude was transformed into a place of shelter and hope. Justino's sacrifice was not forgotten. On the contrary, it became a living memory that even the heaviest mistakes can find a path to forgiveness when the choice is made out of love. Elisa, now strengthened, wore on her chest the medallion that was once a symbol of abandonment and pain, but had become a reminder of redemption. She no longer carried the mark of a forgotten daughter, but of a woman who had survived and found a chance at happiness through suffering. By Antonio's side, her gaze was firm, like someone who knows she no longer needs to hide. The 9 women who remained also found a new purpose. They were no longer orphans thrown to the side of the road. They were landowners, owners of their future, owners of themselves. They worked together, took care of the ranch, planted roots, and built a home where every life had value. And Antonio Garcia, the man the town called a loner, was no longer seen as the mysterious rancher. He became the protector, the guardian of those women, and above all, the man who found the strength to rebuild his life in love and pain. People no longer spoke of the ranch as a scandal, but as an example of courage and justice. Fate had been cruel and full of pain, but in the end, it brought the greatest of all reversals. It united those who never imagined they would be side by side. It transformed sacrifice into hope, and it proved that suffering, when shared, can become a bond that lasts forever. And that is why, even today, anyone who passes through Hope, Texas, hears it said that the Lone Star Ranch is not just made of dirt and cattle, it is made of history, of love, and of tears that taught people how to smile. Now, what do you think of this emotional ending? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Windswept Tales to continue discovering stories from a time when life was hard, but love was true.